Let me take this. I'm going to speak loud enough for once to welcome you this evening to the Third World Studies, Third World in Perspective program, seminar series. This is our 30th year of seminars, believe it or not. I don't know if there's anybody that's been here 30 years except my wife. And she was here for the first program, which was actually February 18th, 1981. And it was on major developments in the Caribbean, Asia, and Africa. And, in Central America, Asia, and I believe the Middle East. Yeah, because Kent Soul was a participant, he's retired. And then, so we've had about 145 of these seminars. And this is the first one this year, of course. And it's on a very important topic. You can read about the Third World Studies in the brochure. And we got tonight the water crisis. So I'm going to move on. I'm not going to give a whole history of Third World Studies here and so forth. The water crisis, issues confronting the global community. And we got three expert speakers, Brian Smith, Jamie Mclennan, and Philip Smedra. And I should say Professors Smith, McLennan, and Smedra. And our first speaker is Brian Smith, who is this going on your third year, right? 4? Okay. I made that mistake last time, I'm sorry. That's not the way to begin. And, but anyhow, he's assistant professor of political science, received his BA in political science from Oberlin College and MA and PhD from Brown University. And before he was here, he was at Middle Georgia College and Colgate University. And teaches a lot of different courses in political science, a lot of international oriented subjects. He's the director of the new Global Studies certificate program here. And this is new because he just told me about it 6 minutes ago. And of course, if I wasn't retired, then there wouldn't be an excuse. But I want to congratulate you on that program. I think the more international things we have, the better it is. So that's fine. Great. But he worked at the Carter Center and also received grants from Brown University and Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's been a frequent participant at Third World programs, and Dr. Smith is going to talk about water as a global issue. So, Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacs. We are talking about water tonight, and for a while I was struggling with the idea as the first speaker to start off with some kind of joke I was trying to come up with some kind of joke related to the two most important liquids in the world. I was going to make a joke about beer and wine being the most important liquids in the world, but of course there's also oil and water. I struggled with this for a while, and then I suddenly realized that in the time that it would have taken me to make that joke, according to average mortality rates, 2 children under the age of 5 would have died from drinking contaminated water in the time it took me to make a joke about water. So I decided to dive right into the more depressing bits. Like oil during the 20th century, managing scarce supplies of clean, fresh water has become more and more of a global challenge. There isn't enough accessible, clean, fresh water in the world, and the problem is rapidly becoming worse. It's often quite a challenge to convince Americans that there's a water crisis, that there's any kind of water problem. We're kind of used to the tap turning on and water coming out of it. We think of it as a renewable resource. I'm usually challenged on this point, saying that, it rains, it flows down rivers, it seems free for all intents and purposes, and really there's only kind of any value associated with water when it comes to providing a little bit of money to bring the water to our homes. In fact, usually in most places in the United States, we only think of water during times of drought. When there's a particular bad period of drought, there obviously becomes sort of a rank of concern, and things get worse. Suddenly you get panic, and then as soon as it starts raining again, we all expect it to return to normal right afterwards. This is actually something some people refer to as the hydroillogical cycle, as opposed to the hydrologic cycle. And even if you don't think of the hydrologic cycle, which is that whole cycle where water just gets used and refreshed and comes back to us from the sky and running down from snow melt and that sort of thing, even if you don't think about it very often, our own eyes tell us that, well, water falls out of the sky. It's rain. Water comes to us free in rivers. So people tend to only think of it in the United States as a local concern of some kind. If Las Vegas naturally has water problems, if you build a city in the middle of a desert and you get millions and millions of people continuously going there and growing the population, of course water is going to be a problem. Of course there's fighting over the Colorado River out west because it's feeding all of these cities and deserts out there. A local concern. But like everything else that's being affected by our exploding population across the entire planet, as well as the rapid industrialization of that planet, water is becoming more and more of a global challenge that is facing all of us, even here in the United States, but certainly around the world. Water has become as much of a global issue as oil, and currently, 1 out of every 3 people living on this planet is living under a state of water crisis. Now, it's not like something that is going to be happening in the future as our population gets larger. We're going to explode to 450 million people, we're predicted, in the next 40 years in the U.S. Georgia itself is expected to get several more million people into our state. We're driving more and more concern about water inside of our own state. But right now, across the planet, 1 out of 3 are living in a crisis today, and that crisis is only getting worse. So why is there a limited amount of water? There's a lot of water on the planet. About 1%, actually less than 1%, of the water on the planet is clean, fresh, accessible water of any kind that could be used for its 3 main purposes: agriculture, industry, and sort of household use. When you think of water use, don't think of the bottled water that you buy to drink to get your daily intake. 70% of water use on the planet is agricultural, 20% is industrial, 10% is what is known as household use. Important things like having enough water to live, but also enough to clean your clothes and take showers. In other words, basic hygiene. And my goal for today, in introducing this topic to you before passing it off to Dr. Mclennan and Dr. Sumedra, is to demonstrate to you some simple examples of how water has become a global issue, touching upon many, many different aspects of human society. I want to give you examples of how this limited resource of accessible fresh water impacts global health issues, global economic issues, global political issues, global environmental issues, and global normative issues. So 5 different global issues that I would like to touch on as rapidly as humanly possible, because I'll need to hand this off soon. I could probably speak for the next 5 hours on each one of those, but time limits will limit me to just a few examples of each one of these different issues. So, health is sort of the most obvious of global issues when it comes to water. It's the most straightforward of the issues. Lack of access to clean, fresh water is endangers human life itself. You need clean, fresh water to simply stay alive to a certain extent. And the population of the world is continuously growing. We have that ever-increasing population, and the amount of fresh water on the earth is limited. On top of that, the location of the water is not always where it needs to be. There might be even enough water, you could say that there's enough fresh water to go around to everybody on the planet right now in terms of daily needed requirements, but the water is not always located where it needs to be. And one of the issues that drives the health issue, health as a global issue, is pollution. There are numerous sorts of ways that water becomes polluted that takes away from that quantity of clean, fresh water available for use. Municipal waste. Many cities dump municipal waste of various kinds, and that's everything from sewage produced from households, but also everything from the soap in water that gets dumped directly into rivers, etc., around cities. Industrial waste also tends to pollute the water supplies around the world, where you have a lot of industrial dumping of chemicals and various industrial waste toxic waste products directly into water, polluting it and taking it away from our supply of clean water. Agricultural waste products are one of the major causes of pollution inside the water systems around the world, really from fertilizer and pesticides. There was a spike up in terms of fertilizer acting as a pollutant ever since they invented essentially ammonium nitrate, artificial fertilizer, and that has been a major issue, taking away from the quantity of clean water in the world. And it makes this pollution either renders that water completely unusable and therefore decreases the amount that can sustain life on this planet, or it becomes extremely expensive to clean it, to treat that water, to take out that pollution. The other, of course, major global issue relating to health for water is disease. There's a lot of different causes of disease related to this limit on the amount of water in the world. First off, there's a lack of sufficient water for good hygiene. Literally, there's throughout much of the world an inability to wash oneself, wash one's clothes. There's just no water available to make sure that disease does not easily spread. So disease spreads not just because water contains disease, but also because you're eliminating the ability to restrict that spread of disease by lack of hygiene. Waterborne diseases, of course, are also a massive health problem. In the developing world, for example, 90% of sewage is dumped untreated directly into rivers, lakes, and coastal waters that then are used as some of the only available water supplies for a great deal of that developing world. You get diseases like cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery. Literally, the list is way too long to get into. So in addition to drinking contaminated water, which causes all of these disease problems, studies have actually shown that one of the other major killers in terms of disease in the world, malaria, is intensified by the lack of a good water system. When you have a poor water system where water is designed to flow directly into people's taps and the water is there immediately whenever you need it, people desperately store up water around their households, leaving standing pools of water nearby that tends to breed malaria, breeding mosquitoes, which adds to the already bad problem of malaria. So there are many extra disease problems linked directly to the lack of easily accessible water. In fact, the World Health Organization estimates that the majority of all sicknesses and disease in the entire world are related in some way to insufficient access to clean water. I've seen estimates. The estimates depend on how the numbers are being calculated or which report you're looking at, but upwards of about 80% of all diseases in the world are in some way related to a lack of clean water. That varies, like I said, but I feel comfortable at least saying majority of all diseases on the planet are caused by lack of access to clean water. So hopefully I can give you a feel for how water obviously is related to health. But there are many other there's other 4 global issues that I mentioned that water are related to. For instance, economic issues. As I said before, the major use of water in the world is agriculture. Irrigation is necessary to produce the kind of agricultural products that we make today that can feed our planet. We have an abundant supply of people to feed, and we have a great deal of agriculture feeding that. And it takes a great deal of irrigation of various kinds to produce all that food. And so whenever water enters into a condition of scarcity, there's a disruption of agricultural production. And that usually happens when some kind of unsustainable amount of water use is reaching its limits, That produces disruption. In other words, if there's some unsustainable source of water, it's not going to last forever, that's being used to produce enough food to feed everyone. Well, since it's unsustainable, eventually that water runs out, the agricultural production will drop, and then suddenly there's massive not only economic disruption, but of course not enough food to feed everybody. It is often commented, in fact, when talking about global food crisis. There's obviously a global food crisis going on. There are people starving to death all around the world as well. And it's often commented on that the amount of food we produce in the world is enough to feed everybody. And that it's just a matter of political will in some way to redistribute that food in such a way that we don't have people dying of malnutrition all across the planet. Well, one problem with that is the amount of food that we do produce currently is in fact enough to feed everybody. However, that amount of food that we produce is unsustainable based on the amount of water it takes to produce it. For example, India, which is currently draining its aquifers at a rate 6 times the replenishment rate that it needs to have to keep its current level of agricultural production going. So disruption of agricultural production is part of the water crisis, how it affects the economic issues. Another economic issue is the immense costs associated with diversion and desalination. 2 sort of separate issues, both relating to just sheer costs to any economy. Diversion of water just means bringing water from where it's not needed to where it's needed. The various governments around the world struggle with this effort of diverting water from one place to another. It is costing enormous sums of money. It's draining productive economic resources around the world. For example, India is planning a diversion of water that it desperately needs from the Himalayas down to the city of Delhi, for example. It is a massive project that is just one part of a set of diversion plans all across India to try to deal with its rapid population growth and the desperate need they have for water there. Just to give you an idea of how much it's going to cost India, current estimates of economists are saying that the cost of diversion of water for India for these plans is the equivalent of what India plans to spend on education for the next 200 years. Just this diversion project could have funded education for 200 years in India. That's how expensive these diversion projects usually are. In terms of desalination plants, one of the usual responses that I have from students or talking to somebody in the community about the fact that there is a water crisis, that we're running out of fresh water, they point to the oceans. There are these massive bodies of water with all this salt in it, but we can desalinate it. There are such things as desalination plants, and there are in fact 12,300 desalination plants already out there in the world. 1/4 of the production capacity, by the way, is inside Saudi Arabia. 1/4 of all of that production capacity, not 1/4 of all plants, but all 1/4 of the production capacity of all those plants is just in that one country, Saudi Arabia. And there's a reason for that. Not only is it a desert, but they're also insanely wealthy. They were a country that could afford to build that many desalination plants. And all of those plants, those 12,300 plants, their concurrent production rate comes to less than 1/3 of 1% of the total freshwater use in the world today. So it's literally a drop in the bucket right now in terms of what we would need if we were going to continue to grow our population and reduce our access to clean fresh water. There are also there's some problems with the desalination plants. There's a reason why there aren't more of them. First of all, they're very expensive to build. They're really billions of dollars per plant. Depends on the amount of capacity the plant has, will vary the cost, but these are extremely difficult to build, and that cost doesn't even include the need to transport the water from the desalination plant off of the coast deeper into the inland if that's where the water is needed. They're also very energy intensive. They're incredibly expensive to run in terms of energy. So it's not just building it, but maintaining it is extremely expensive. And obviously it consumes lots of energy, and we're kind of worried about energy supplies in the world now too. It's sort of like one crisis feeding into another crisis, the energy crisis. And if that wasn't enough, desalination plants are also extremely polluting. For every 1 liter of fresh water that they create, desalinated water that they create 1 liter of toxic waste. That is kind of highly toxic and poisonous and has a tendency just to be dumped out into the coastal waters that it is pulling salt water out of. And if that wasn't enough of a problem, if one is thinking of desalination as creating pristine water, all the desalination processes do is pull the salt out. It doesn't actually decontaminate any of the diseases or pollution that might be present in these coastal waters that they're drawing in from. So there are immense costs associated with both diversion processes and desalination. Other economic issues. There's increasing concern for states concerning trade in what is called trade in virtual water. As a global economic issue, you see states having to come to terms with the fact that as they're engaging in economic exchange with other countries, they are trading, quote, virtual water. They're starting to really recognize, particularly the drier parts of the world, they're starting to recognize that when they're trading, say, biofuel from one country to another, that biofuel took immense amounts of water to create. For example, 1 liter of ethanol requires 1,700 liters of water. And so they realize that for instance, China buys a great deal of ethanol from abroad, and those countries that are exporting to them are starting to realize that they're also exporting transporting water. India has been dealing with this reality for quite some time. It takes 1 ton of grain, to make 1 ton of grain, it takes 1,000 tons of water to make. And so whenever you ship grain from one country to another, you're essentially trading this virtual water from one place to another. And it's become a global economic issue in trade negotiations where they're having to take into consideration how much water is being exchanged between places. Finally, the last economic issue I want to mention is the rather crippling effect to development in the third world of the water-related issues. Throughout the developing world, there are immense infrastructure costs associated with providing access to clean, fresh water that are just literally too high for most poor countries' governments to provide. The infrastructure necessary to modernize and create a system that won't leak water all over the place as you're piping it from one location to another. This infrastructure costs, as their populations grow, are a huge burden on these already struggling economies. When they get world aid, there is various global aid from the World Bank, various World Bank projects, et cetera, trying to help these countries modernize their infrastructure, but oftentimes that modernization only is limited to a few cities and never actually gets out to the countryside where in fact a great deal of the water is needed. Another impact that's hurting development in the third world related to water is simply the lost productivity caused by all the diseases. When you consider the number of people who are sick plus all the healthcare costs created by the water, there's a massive depressing effect on any country's attempt to develop. You can actually, economists spend a great deal of time measuring GDP growth, and you can look at the depressive effect of simply lacking clean water because of health reasons. Health effects on GDP growth. Literally, they'll look at it and say, well, in this particular country, 2 to 3% GDP growth can be traced to health issues, and a lot of those health issues are traced to the lack of water. So literally, the ability to become less poor, to develop more, is being restrained by lost productivity from disease. And finally, in terms of restraining development throughout the so-called third world, there's a great deal of problems in terms of just lost productivity related to time. It takes a great deal of time and effort in a lot of these countries to move water from where it is to where your family's household needs it. It is a massive time consumer every day, literally out there across the third world. Every single day, you have usually young girls walking immense distances, spending 3, 4, 5 hours a day doing nothing other than hauling water from where they can get it back to their homes. And this not only creates lost productivity in terms of the time invested doing nothing other than trying to get water to survive on a daily basis, but it also has a significant gender issue effect around the world, where most of these young girls end up not going to school because they have to spend the time walking water from wherever they can get it back to their family. So that's economic, water scarcity as an economic global issue. As a political issue, sort of my field, political science. As a political issue, water scarcity is taking on more and more of an importance in the world. The first is a couple of things I want to mention about water as a political global issue, is a very political issue. And that is who decides how water is diverted or appropriated? Who gets to say? If we're going to be diverting water around the world from one place to another, whether it's internal to a country or between countries, who has the right to sit at that table to make those decisions? Because right now the decisions have already been made. People are making these decisions all around the world, and usually it is certainly not following any kind of democratic process, either at the domestic level or at the international level. At the international level, countries have been, and businesses have been sorting out international law and procedures for water rights and investments. And there is a very political issue out there about who should have a say in that process. These laws are being decided. They've been decided over the past few years, and they're continuing to be decided. Right now, the World Trade Organization treats water as a commodity. And that already has legal implications for our economy as well as the economy of every other country, and that right to water inside of an economy, that it's treated as a commodity. And right now there's a debate about whether or not to turn water into a service, to reclassify in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, water as a service rather than a commodity. And that has drastic implications for things like privatization and unprivatization. If a country decides to privatize its water system and it's now a service according to WTO rules, the people rising up and demanding, say like in the Bolivian water war, that we unprivatize that water because it's some kind of human right, well, if we make it a service under the WTO, there would be automatic punishments put in place by the WTO if you tried to unprivatize a service as opposed to a commodity. And that seemingly arcane little piece of law is going to have massive drastic effects on everybody's everyday lives going into the next century. And the question then becomes, well, who's deciding that? Who is deciding that issue? What is the process that's deciding it? So it's a very political issue concerning rights and procedures and concerns about investment. Privatization itself is a political issue around the world that I've just sort of vaguely touched on. What has been seen frequently as a public good. The idea that water is just something that sort of exists, that everybody has a right to. We're kind of used to paying a little bit to maybe have a government, build the infrastructure to bring it to us. But otherwise, it's a public good. It falls from the sky. It's free use for everybody. The value of the water is free. It's just getting it to you, maybe, that you have to pay for. Well, we are in the process of privatizing ownership of water. If you rely on a lake and this well over here for your farm, and then a plant comes along and starts pumping out all the water, and suddenly your farm dies, and he has the right to do that, they have the right to do that pumping, then it becomes very much a non-public goods situation where there actually is a limited supply of that resource and it is being claimed for private profit. And privatization of water rights in entire countries is becoming a critical political issue. In fact, it's becoming such a one that, if I was rich, if I was rich today or 10 years ago, I would have invested like all of my money in the international water companies, Suez and Thames Water, et cetera, like that, and now I'd be very rich and I'd be filthy rich soon. The international water companies are working very hard to privatize water around the world. Environmental issues, only two more to go. Environmental and normative issues. There are global environmental issues, of course, relating to water. One of the less obvious is a connection between climate change and water. There is sort of a reinforcing cycle as there's global warming going on and there is a lack of clean access to fresh water, and they sort of reinforce each other. The easiest way to describe this relationship is by pointing out, oh, good, your goodness. Yeah, I'm sorry. Is to point out that global warming is reducing glaciers, and glaciers feed rivers. And that could mean a decrease in the flow of water to important areas. The Indus River, for example, feeds the entire agricultural breadbasket of Pakistan, and it is almost the majority of it is glacial fed. There are also surface environment problems. I'll skip describing the Aral Sea because I believe the gentleman following me, Dr. Mclennan, will describe the effect on the Aral Sea of over-irrigation. Here's the fourth largest sea that's basically now vanished. 90% of it's gone due to over-irrigation. Desertification is spreading. The Nile. Nile is so overused that when it hits the Mediterranean, it no longer has enough force to actually push fresh water into the Med, and in fact, salt water is flowing into the Nile at its source. But also there's groundwater, important groundwater considerations, such as the draining of fossil aquifers. Aquifers are kind of like checking accounts under the water, is the common metaphor. You get an income as it rains and fills, and you can spend out of it, but if you spend out of it faster than you're coming in, you're going to drain your checking account until it runs out. Well, fossil aquifers don't get refilled. It's like having a checking account and being unemployed. It takes millions of years to fill up, and it's not going to refill. And we have, for example, the Ogallala Aquifer that runs from northern Nebraska all the way down into Texas, and it is the major source of water for much of our Midwest farming and ranching, etc. In fact, we are draining the Ogallala fossil aquifer, so non-renewable, at the rate of 12 billion cubic meters a year. That's the equivalent of entire annual flow of 18 Colorado rivers, and it's going to run out. It's a limited, finite quantity. Finally, my very last thing, that's very quick, is normative issues. Water is a global normative issue. That issue basically can be summed up as, should water access be a human right? It's a question that's being discussed around the world. Human rights in the 20th century at least got added to the conversation. We can argue about how often countries actually pay attention to human rights, but at least it's part of the conversation now. And so people are as water scarcity issues increase, people are discussing more and more whether or not water, something sort of necessary for life, should be a human right, should be added to the various human rights, should be treated as any kind of commodity, or should the minimum necessary for life be considered something that should be free, available to everyone as a human right? So that normative question is out there facing the global community as well. And with that, I am more than out of time. So thank you for your attention.
Our next speaker is Dr. Jamie Mclennan, who I just met this evening. In fact, I know him from electronically, you might say. But anyhow, he's assistant professor of sociology here at GSW, specializing in environmental sociology and outdoor recreation, and received his master's and PhD from Rutgers State University at New Brunswick. I noticed on the website of the Department of Sociology that they had you getting a PhD from the University of Maryland.
Not true.
Well, okay. But they had it on there, and I just wanted to clarify. I checked some other sources, and I'm glad it's Rutgers because I'm originally from New Jersey. So anyhow, the subject of his doctoral dissertation was the social processes among long-distance hikers on the Appalachian Trail. And he's done a lot of research on that subject and published articles on it. And he is going to discuss social and economic aspects of the water dilemmas. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mclennan.
Brought some of my own water. My students ask me once in a while what's in there. I promise it's water. Good evening, thank you all for coming. My name is Jamie Mclennan, and I'm a sociologist here at Georgia Southwestern. I consider myself an environmental sociologist, and one of the areas I'm most interested in is natural resources. So before I get into the water situation, I'd like to say just a few things about environmental sociology and the valuable contributions it can make to understanding the water situation. Environmental sociologists seek to utilize all useful insights of sociology including an understanding of power and social relationships, the importance of culture, politics, economics, history, and even psychological considerations, while at the same time incorporating a hard scientific understanding of the physical world, including biology and chemistry, for instance. So it is interdisciplinary in nature, and I believe that that is what it will take for us to understand and solve the major environmental problems that we have. We need to consider everything from the microbiological agents that cause disease to the global social structural factors that influence water availability and who has control of it. That said, let's take a look at the water situation and what are some of the issues and where we're headed and some of the possible solutions. As Dr. Smith mentioned, and I'm sure some of you are aware, what's happened with the Aral Sea, which was the fourth largest inland sea and freshwater lake in the world. It straddles the border between the former Soviet republics of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan in Central Asia. And it has shrunk, as Dr. Smith said, 90% due to the diversion of the two rivers that feed it for irrigation, mainly cotton. This photo was taken of it last summer and shows that the southern portion of the lake has almost completely dried up. One of the more surreal images that comes from this was what happened when they tried to dig canals to follow the retreating lake and couldn't dig fast enough to keep up with the lake. This has actually been called the biggest environmental catastrophe in human history, up until, of course, the BP oil leak. Now you've got boats 100 miles away from the current shoreline, so it's kind of a strange situation there. What most people don't know about the Aral Sea situation is this caused the entire commercial fishing industry to collapse. They were catching basically 50,000 tons of fish a year, employed 60,000 people, and it's gone. But to be fair, the agriculture has thrived to the point where there's now millions of people employed in agriculture, and they're bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And this, as Dr. Smith talked about, this one example illustrates the importance of water for the agricultural system. As he said, 70% of the water humans use goes to agriculture. It takes an estimated 53 gallons of water to make the average glass of milk, and 2,500 gallons of water to make the average pound of feedlot beef. The Aral Sea situation also illustrates the fact that most of the decisions made to divert a dam or a river, to divert or dam a river, benefits some people and hurts others. So while agriculture has thrived, commercial fishing has collapsed, and now you've also got toxic sandstorms of dust, salt, pesticides, and other chemicals in the area, resulting in a spike in the incidence of acute respiratory disorders, certain types of cancers, as well as a disturbingly high infant mortality rate of 75 per 1,000 live births, which is more than 10 times that of the United States. Toxic dust from the area has been found as far away as the South Pole in the blood of penguins. And as you can imagine, the loss of such a large volume of water has had an effect on the regional climate, such that the summers are shorter and hotter because the water is not there to moderate the heat. The winters are also colder and longer as the water is not there to stifle the Siberian winds. Again, we have benefits to some and costs to others. A similar dynamic takes place in the building of dams, where central planners, in cooperation with corporations and international lending agencies like the World Bank, expropriate resources from some people and give them to others. There has been a rash of dam building around the world. In 1900, there were no dams taller than 15 meters. By 1950, there were 5,270 of them, two of which were in China. By 1980, there were 36,562 in the world, 18,820 of them in China. Now there's close to 30,000 large dams in China. And the most famous of these, the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River, completed in 2006, is the largest dam in the world. It produces the most hydroelectricity in the world, and it is the dam that has displaced the most people in the world, estimates upwards of 1.5 million people. It's almost 1.5 miles long, 600 feet high, and has flooded close to 400 miles of scenic gorges, 1,000 villages, and 13 cities. In this case, the stated benefits include providing clean, renewable hydroelectricity, flood control, drinking water, water for irrigation, navigational improvement, aquaculture, tourism, and the transfer of water from south to north. However, besides the environmental problems associated with the dam, including the submerging of industrial plants without having cleaned them up, the increased incidence of landslides, and the possible seismic consequences due to the weight of that much water behind the dam, there's obviously, though, also a social cost to displacing that many people. In fact, there have been protests over the resettlement in the case of this dam and many others in China because people feel they have not been adequately compensated, or if they're farmers, their new land they don't feel is as good. But once the dam is built, they're generally on their own. Incidentally, a recent estimate by Brian Richter of the Nature Conservancy's Global Freshwater Program says that he put the number displaced by dams worldwide at 472 million people. This includes not just the people flooded out, but people living downstream whose livelihoods as farmers or fishers are affected by a reduced water flow. The generally undisputed number of people displaced worldwide is put at 80 million. The Three Gorges Dam, though, and some of the other large water projects in China also exemplify what I was talking about earlier, namely the appropriation of water from one set of users and giving it to another. China has big plans in place to divert large amounts of water from southern rivers, mainly the Yangtze, to northern cities like Beijing, home to 20 million inhabitants. Although 10% of Beijing's water usage is currently feeding luxury gardens and swimming pools and new apartment buildings, there is just not enough water there to meet current, let alone rising demand. We're talking about a country with 20% of the world's population and only 7% of the world's water. They've also got major pollution problems due to their rapid economic growth. The government admits that 70% of their rivers and lakes are polluted, according to this article from Reuters, and they're quoting a news agency in China. 9 out of every 10 cities are the groundwater is polluted. The following are pictures taken by the Chinese photojournalist Lu Guang. This is the Yellow River, which is too smelly for this gentleman to handle. We've got here a young woman washing dishes in a polluted lake in Guangdong Province. Here is industrial wastewater flowing into the Yellow River from an Inner Mongolian industrial district. And here is where the Zhenjiang titanium mill discharges its wastewater into the Yangtze. According to the caption that accompanied the photo, 1,000 meters downstream is where the city of Danyang gets its water. So clearly, China has some serious water quality and availability issues going forward. And the strategies undertaken by the Chinese are surprisingly common throughout the world. For instance, Namibia in southern Africa has plans to divert some 20 million cubic meters of water annually, or 700 liters per second, from the Okavango River through a 150-mile pipeline to its capital, Windhoek, where water demand is expected to double by 2020. This is a map of the Okavango watershed with the black line indicating the pipeline they're planning to run. Unfortunately, the people in Botswana who live downstream are dependent upon the Okavango for their livelihoods. The Okavango River is actually quite interesting, as it does not reach the ocean, but ends in the world's largest inland delta of 6,000 square miles, home to 100,000 people and the greatest concentration of birds, fish, and other animals in Africa. And if too much water gets diverted, the oasis could dry up with, unknown consequences for society and the environment. It's a tough situation, though, because Namibia, being one of the driest countries in southern Africa, desperately needs the water. Just like in Libya, a water-stressed country where almost no rain falls, and coastal aquifers are overdrawn and suffer from saltwater intrusion, they've decided to solve their water problems by pumping from large aquifers in the south to their population centers over 1,000 miles away along the Mediterranean coast. The project, referred to as the Great Man-Made River, began in 1984 and already sends some 6.5 million cubic meters of water every day through pipelines of about 2,500 miles and 12 feet in diameter, even though they recognize that it's unsustainable because the aquifers are just not recharging nearly that fast. But they don't have much of a better choice, as desalination costs a lot more. They're just hoping something will save them by the time the aquifers run out 30 or 40 years from now. Another water trouble spot in Africa is in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, which gets 90% of its country's export earnings from oil, about $45 billion in 2005, exporting roughly 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. Yet the per capita income is $1,200 and declining in a country of 150 million. Nigeria used to be self-sufficient in food and ironically imports most of its fuel due to a lack of domestic refineries. Often, people in countries like Nigeria with oil or mineral wealth say that it is actually a curse on their societies, like the situation in Sierra Leone with diamonds. And in this case, the Nigerian government documented 6,817 oil spills between 1976 and 2001, about one a day for 25 years. And outside experts think it may be 10 times that bad. While about 50,000 acres of mangrove forests have been destroyed. So this is just devastating the fishing in the Niger Delta, something the local inhabitants have relied on for sustenance. One of the results of this injustice has been the emergence of the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, these guys, a guerrilla group that has attacked oil infrastructure like pipelines, refineries, drilling platforms, and also kidnapped foreign oil workers. In this case, they're not fighting over water exactly as much as oil and the profits from its extraction, but I think that the way that oil is affecting their way of life in terms of pollution, water pollution, is part of it. And one of the other controversial issues surrounding water is Dr. Smith started talking about is that of water privatization. This comes up when a private company gains control over a water resource and turns around and sells it either to the local population or, in the case of bottled water, on the international market. For instance, as Dr. Smith alluded to, there's a well-known case of water privatization gone bad in Bolivia in the late 1990s when the country restructured World Bank loans, and one of the conditions of that was the privatization of, among other things, the water supply of Cochabamba, the third largest city in Bolivia. So the Bechtel company of San Francisco came in and started charging people upwards of $20 a month for water. And I know that doesn't sound like much, but the minimum wage at the time in Bolivia was $70 a month. And they even made it illegal to collect rainwater. There were riots, and the Bolivian government sent in the riot squad to essentially protect the interests of multinational corporations. In the end, though, the Bolivian government did cancel its contract with Bechtel. And this is not unlike what is going on elsewhere in the world, such as in India, where there is a lot of controversy over the appropriation of water for profit by international beverage companies, mostly Coca-Cola. In this case, Indian farmers are accusing Coca-Cola of pumping so much water that it's causing them to have to dig deeper wells, and in some cases they just don't have the money to dig deep enough for water. Of course, Coca-Cola denies that they're having any impact on water levels, but these cases speak to some important practical and philosophical issues when it comes to water, as Dr. Smith mentioned, such as who owns water? Who gets to make decisions about water? Should access to water be considered a fundamental human right? And the UN, as far as I've read recently, they just actually declared in July that access to water is a fundamental human right, which reverses their decision from 2008 that it is not. Also, we may ask, how will disputes over water be decided? And if governments are not receptive to the needs of the people, we will probably see more conflicts over water. Not necessarily between nations, but within nations. After all, as Mark Twain is quoted as saying, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting. In all seriousness, although it has been 4,500 years since two nations have gone to war over water, in that case between the two Sumerian city-states of Lagash and Umma in what is now Iraq, many people have warned that tensions and conflicts over water are likely to increase down the line, including former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who in 2001 said, quote, "Fierce competition for fresh water may well become a source of conflict and wars in the future." Then there's Ismail Serageldin, the World Bank's Commissioner for Environmental Affairs and Chairman of the World Water Commission, who stated bluntly a few years ago that, quote, "The wars of the 21st century will be fought over water." So where does that leave you and me? Well, for one, as Dr. Smith mentioned, there is a great profit potential in the water sector. In fact, over the past decade, it has produced returns 4 times that of the S&P, the Standard & Poor's Stock Index, and is expected to grow 2 to 3 times that of the wider economy over the next 20 years, as water demand is expected to grow at twice the rate of population growth. Of course, if we are to empower local communities in their struggle with centralized state and corporate actors, we might want to consider who we invest with. Thankfully, there are a handful of quote-unquote environmentally responsible investors and mutual funds, but of course, do your own due diligence. Alternatively, we can support entities resisting expropriation as well as those organizations that utilize small-scale solutions to water scarcity. One such organization is called Spring of Hope, founded by Brittany Young there on the left. When she was in high school in Florida, with the goal of raising money to dig wells at rural schools in sub-Saharan Africa, she was inspired by a trip she took there with her mother in the summer of 2005, during which she visited a school of over 1,000 students that did not have any running water. Brittany ultimately raised the money to build a well there in 2006 and has since raised enough money for at least 7 additional wells. Or, if you're feeling really ambitious, you could do something like what 48-year-old Australian Pat Farmer is going to do and run from the North to the South Pole in an attempt to raise $100 million for water and sanitation programs through the Red Cross. Or you could just donate money to his cause if there's no Forrest Gumps in the room. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Dr. Philip Smedra. He's no stranger to the Third World Series. He's Associate Professor of Economics here. He got his BA degree in Economics from Penn State University, his Master's and PhD from the University of Georgia. He was in the Peace Corps in Morocco, and he worked for the Department of Agriculture. And he has a wide, vast experience in international studies, and he's taken students to study abroad program, the Maymester program in 2010, American University, Bulgaria. And he was recently, this past summer, visiting professor at Ningbo University of Technology in the People's Republic of China. And Dr. Smedra is going to talk about the public health implications of clean water access. So please join me in welcoming.
First off, I'd like to thank Dr. Isaacs for putting on these Third World in Perspective series. I've been doing it since I got here in 2001, and it's a great opportunity for GSW faculty to talk about things that they're interested in. I think it benefits students, it benefits the community. So Dr. Isaacs probably needs a round of applause while I'm pulling up the so much for brownie points. Okay, well, you know, what else is there to say about water? My two colleagues have really kind of summed up all the pertinent points, but what I want to do is talk a little bit about public health, which Dr. Smith mentioned, and what I'll try to do is reinforce some of the points that he talked about. The way I thought I'd start this off is with a quote by Mahatma Gandhi. The difference between what we do and what we are capable of doing would suffice to solve most of the world's problems, which is why they call this guy the Mahatma, the teacher. You can take this and apply it to the problem of water access and clean water and sanitation. What we do right now and what we could do, given the information and given the resources that we have, would solve all the world's problems. And you know, the big question is why, you know, we know what needs to be done. We simply haven't had the will or the wherewithal as a global community to address these problems. These problems aren't new. The problems with water, the things that are affecting the developing world now were very well known just 100 years ago. And if you're 20 years old, 100 years sounds like eons ago, but if you're, of a certain age, 100 years was not all that long ago. We're talking about 1910. And places like New York City and Paris and London were essentially cesspools. The infant mortality rate in these cities were as high as they are now in sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason for that is because of polluted water that people in these cities had to drink and had to do their daily functions with. And so the way that these cities became metropolises, places that you want to live in, is because one of the basic reasons is because they concentrated on providing clean water to their citizens. This is what the developing world needs. Those of you who don't recognize what this is a squat toilet. This is the way the world goes to the bathroom. The lucky people in the world. If we could provide, and when I say we, what I'm talking about is the global community. If the global community could provide toilets like this to every village, or a number of these toilets, to every village in sub-Saharan Africa, to every community in South Asia, we could probably push the speed of development in those countries, in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, much, much faster than what's happening now. The hundreds of billions of dollars that have been devoted to aid, foreign aid, by Western countries typically, to people in sub-Saharan Africa and people in South Asia and people in Asia, people in South America, many of those dollars have been wasted. And those dollars have gone toward infrastructure programs, developing roads, or providing agriculture with new technologies in order to increase productivity, in order to feed burgeoning populations. If we'd taken just a small percentage of that money and directed it toward providing toilets that did not pollute water courses, did not pollute the groundwater, we would be much more toward the world that we have a notion of, where everybody is healthy, most people are healthy, people don't fall sick because of drinking or bathing in or using polluted water. So this would be a very simple solution to, and people in development are beginning to understand this now. And what Dr. Isaacs mentioned, I was in the Peace Corps. 20 years ago, one of the groups of American people that I went with, young people like you, was devoted to sanitation. And what they did while they were in Morocco for 2 years was help communities typically up in the mountains to build latrines, build bathrooms so these people didn't go to the toilet next to a water course. There's plenty of water up in the mountains because of snow melt, but people typically go to the toilet next to a water course so they can wash their hands afterwards. And that pollutes the water. And it's okay if you're upstream, but if you're downstream, you're going to be drinking and using this water. Some numbers. 2.6 billion people lack basic sanitation. That's half of the developing world. And this very high rate of infant mortality. In the year 2010, in the 21st century, we still have almost 2 million infants and young children under the age of 5 that die because of diarrhea, for goodness sakes. I mean, if you get diarrhea here, you rehydrate yourself. If it's really severe, you take the baby to the hospital, they start an IV, and you give them some medication that plugs the kid up, and you go home. But kids die in sub-Saharan Africa because of diarrhea, for goodness sakes, and because they're drinking polluted water. The global community has started to take notice of the problem with water. This is kind of expanding my purview a bit here. The State Department in March of this year declared water scarcity a central U.S. foreign policy concern. So it recognizes that people's access to water could be a spark point for conflict in the world. More than 1 billion people have inadequate access to water. 2 billion people who have access to water, a water source within 1 kilometer, use about 5 gallons a day. So, and as Dr. Smith mentioned, typically it's young girls, or sometimes older girls, women, I recall, again, many times when you go to the developing world, you see women who are bent at a 90-degree angle. The people in rural areas, and they're bent, these older women, older like 50, they're bent at a 90-degree angle because they spent their entire lives carrying water from the water course where it's available to their village. And it's really something to see. These women can't stand up because they have been carrying water every day of their lives, sometimes twice a day. Again, more than a billion people lack access to clean water, use less than 1 gallon a day. The average American uses 150 gallons of water a day for all of our uses, including the food that we eat. Dr. Mclennan mentioned that pound of beef, those 4 quarter pounders that you had for lunch, take about 2,500 gallons of water to produce. That's what's included in this average daily use of water by Americans. So since Dr. Isaacs asked me to do this presentation, now when I brush my teeth, I just kind of wet the toothbrush and turn off the tap. And to shave, I just kind of wet the razor and turn off the tap. So even though we live in a humid region, humid meaning there's plenty of water down here, but still, maybe that water that I'm saving is going to be taken by the water cycle up into the air and dumped someplace where it's needed. So I've changed my habits as a result of being a participant in this program. Half of all the people in the developing world at any given time suffer from a health problem caused by water sanitation deficits. So half the people in the developing world are sick because they don't have access to clean water. And so we're expecting, again, going back to a development perspective, we're providing hundreds of billions of dollars, the world community, hundreds of billions of dollars in development aid, new technologies for agriculture, new infrastructure, building roads so agriculture can have an access to city markets. But we're asking sick people to use these new implements and use this new technology. Why not focus on getting these people well? And then we can think about how those well people can conduct their affairs in order to develop their country. So we're looking at development 3 steps away from where we should be focusing our efforts, and that's basic public health. And it's obvious that if half the people in the developing world are sick, that means that half the people that are in hospitals in the developing world are there because of exposure to dirty water. 5,000 children a day, multiply that by 365, and you get about 1.8 million kids die of diseases related to poor sanitation and drinking water that's horrendously polluted. Poor health in later life. So even if your kid doesn't die from diarrhea, is sick, what that does is prevent that kid from thriving during his or her childhood, and that has impact on that person's productivity the rest of his or her life. And also it has an impact on brain development. So individuals, many times when you travel to South America, you travel to South Asia, you travel to Africa, many times people are smaller than us. And one of the reasons is because they were sick with diarrhea for the first 3 years of their life. And they simply don't have many times, the intellectual capacity to help their economies grow because of childhood illnesses associated with lack of water. And again, Dr. Smith mentioned that economists have estimated what this impact is. Economists try to estimate impacts on gross domestic product. I do it myself in other topics besides water. But here's an estimate saying that clean water access could improve less developed country gross domestic product by up to 4%. All we need to do is provide clean water to people in the developing world, and that ipso facto would help their economies to grow. So it's not rocket science. Provide them clean water, and we could do a much better job of helping them grow than everything else that we've done over the past 50 years. And here's a bit of about water use. 12% of the world's population uses 85% of its water. Half of humanity in 20 years is going to live in regions of high water stress, including the United States. Dr. Mclennan mentioned that Las Vegas is a place that probably nobody should be living. The entire Los Angeles Basin is a place where now about 20 million people live, Los Angeles and all the towns and cities around it. There's no reason at all why there should be a megalopolis in Southern California. It's a desert. And in order to be there, the Colorado River is being accessed. And sooner or later, we're going to have to go up into Canada. And hopefully they'll let us take some of that water that they have in plenitude. Otherwise, we're going to have to fight the Canadians. Can you believe it? One of the big issues of the later 20th century and now the 21st century is urbanization. Lots of rural people are going to big urban centers. In Africa, in South America, people living in bidonvilles, in shanty towns. And typically there is no sewage treatment or a way to deal with human waste in shanty towns. In water access in places like Lagos, which is not the capital of Nigeria, but the business capital of Nigeria, half the population has no access to proper sanitation systems. I was reading, again, in preparation for this, that there is not one city in all of India, not one city in all of India that has 24-hour public access to water. Even in Delhi or Mumbai or Madras and all throughout that country that's considered to be an Asian tiger, there is no one city where you can turn on the tap at 3 o'clock in the morning and have access to clean water. It has to be rationed. Even in Delhi, even in the capital of this very populous country, rationing is the norm. And water is finite, although we have this hydrologic cycle, meaning that you can't create new water, but we can use old water. Unfortunately, as both of my colleagues had talked about, most of the water that's available to us is seawater. And the other 3%, 70% is frozen. And most of the water that we use, all the water that we use is either groundwater or the water in rivers and lakes. There are some countries that don't have any problems, like Brazil, like Russia, Canada. And Canada's right next door. And we'll probably be accessing those. We already access those trees. We need some of that water. And I'm sure it's going to be piped down to places that are in dire need of water, like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Los Angeles and San Diego. And we do have a good water source in the U.S., the Great Lakes region. 20% of all the fresh water in the world is right in the Great Lakes. The city I grew up in, upstate New York, takes its water directly from Lake Ontario. The pipes just suck it in, it's treated a little bit, and it's put into the tap of every household that's on the water system. And the water is bad tasting, just like it is here in Americus. Do you folks drink the water out of the tap here? Really? Wow. Congratulations. I tried to do that, but I can't. So I filter it. So even in places where you think the water's okay, and probably it's okay, I mean, you're not going to catch anything from it, but it doesn't have a, why do I see people drinking bottled water? Why is there an entire aisle at Walmart devoted to bottles of water? Meaning people aren't drinking the local water. Anyway, water distribution, I'll be done in just a few minutes, and we'll have some questions. Access to water requires infrastructure, which is why people in rural countries or rural areas in the developing world don't have good access to water because it's expensive to develop this infrastructure. So again, if we're going to be spending money on development, it probably needs to go toward helping these countries develop an infrastructure that provides clean water to rural areas to get these people healthy again and begin them on the road to development. This is a picture from Haiti, getting water in the same creek that cute little pig is bathing in. Water is a right, and both of my colleagues were talking about this. Many people believe that access to water is a human right, a democratic resource. It's a public good, as Dr. Smith said. A public good is a good that has no price on it. We have a right to water. Well, okay, if you don't put a price on it, then, and if everybody has access to it, we see the result. I'm pretty much a market-based person. I think that, given that there have been companies that have taken advantage, but in order to develop water structures, infrastructure for water, we need the private market to become involved. And so charge individuals, but provide them some kind of a subsidy so water doesn't cost $20 a month. Maybe it'll cost $1 or $2 a month. That makes sense. And it provides an incentive for companies to get involved and provide the infrastructure that's necessary. So with adequate water, the poor can work their way out of poverty. First of all, give them water to drink that's clean. Let them and their children get over the illnesses that are created by drinking and bathing and using dirty water. And once they become healthy, that water can be used in agriculture, and their agricultural productivity will increase. Most of these countries have economies that are agricultural based, and the country will thrive. These kids have just pulled this water. Hopefully they're not going to drink that. They'll take it home and boil it before they drink this. And also Dr. Smith mentioned this issue about gender and how water affects, or access to water, or having girls, in this case, going out searching for water and bringing it back and spending hours, causes them not to go to school. I mean, people have kids in order to get them to work. The family needs them to work in the developing world. And the role of the female is to make sure that there's food on the table and there's water to drink and to wash and to do all of that. And these kids are deprived of their rights as human beings to develop their human capacity, because they're out 4 or 5 hours a day tromping around with a 5-gallon tank of water on their back. So, no act of terrorism generates economic devastation on the scale of the crisis in water and sanitation. It's becoming more and more of an issue. Once the United Nations recognizes it as a problem, once the United States State Department recognizes it as a problem, then we're on the road to actually having concrete measures to do something about this issue. And finally, the health impacts of drinking and using dirty water impedes productivity. Everybody should have access to clean water, and in order to live a life that is dignified and productive. And that's that. So, good.
We have time for a few questions. We have a class coming in here at 8 o'clock, and they're taking a test, so I've been asked to don't let it go beyond that. So, are there any questions with all this great information? There must be some questions. Huh?
I think the panel did a great job, but I want to recommend a movie out there called For the Love of Water. It's about 2 years old. It won a Sundance Award, but it goes over the issues of privatization, which is really a disaster, and the billions of dollars that market is stealing, and some of the human rights out there that are being ignored. So if you have a chance, if you're interested, they've got a great website, but it's called For the Love of Water. So.
And it'll tell you which companies to invest in because they're dominating.
Yeah, good luck. Not too as. If you look at some of the names, you can see where the money's going.
Okay, are there any other?
I've got one question.
Yeah.
What could the typical individual do in terms of curbing water use, and what kind of impact might that have on water supply? Does anyone have that kind of data?
Well, in Georgia, obviously we just passed that new law that doesn't seem to be getting around very much, that we're not supposed to be watering our lawns using automated means between 10 and 4, and that's really the first tentative step to dealing with the fact that Georgia massively overuses water. We're in battles with 4 states right now in illegal attempts to get more water for our state, and we're expecting millions more to come into the state soon. we're growing as a state, and our water use is through the roof. So everything from taking shorter showers to simply limiting how you use water, to planting grass that doesn't, or various types of plants, landscaping that doesn't use as much water. But part of the problem there for us as individual citizens is the fact that, as we have all sort of mentioned, 10% of water use globally is household, and that's sort of still true for the United States, even though we have a higher percent of industrial use inside the U.S. The real cost of water for our region in this area is agriculture. We've been massively investing in extra irrigation throughout the state of Georgia, and that's drastically increased our water use. I think one of the most important things in terms of trying to help out locally or within our state is to pursue through our politicians some kind of extra regulation of who can sink a well where, how much water can be extracted. Right now, those laws are completely open for our state as they are across most of the United States, and we should really, in my opinion, get our government more involved in at least tracking water use, so we understand where it's going and who's using it, so we can deal with the inevitable problem of higher population, same amount of water.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for 3 wonderful presentations. I want to thank you for your attendance.